The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio, where information never sleeps. I am your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. Joining us today is my lovely partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
Welcome to the program. Today is a historic day in history, and we are going to memorialize that in the first half of the show. We're going to discuss the 44th anniversary of the historic May 18th, 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which is in fact the most disastrous volcanic eruption in U.S. history. But it is not the largest eruption in North American history, so we'll cover that too, and we'll discuss the Cascades in general. In the second half of the show, we're going to be bringing up some mind-bending information on ancient humans that may have been in America 37,000 years ago. This site is called the Hartley Mammoth Site. On a previous show, we talked about the Cerruti Mammoth Site, which is 130,000 years old. This is 37,000 years old and is even more compelling for human occupation than the Cerruti site.
It is tremendously compelling, and I would argue inarguable.
Yeah, and we'll get to that and why it might be controversial. I think there's a really good explanation for that. If we have time, we're going to jump over to a very old site. This is a 500,000-year-old cave deposit. The cave is called the Tunel Wielki cave. It's in southern Poland. And it's not a new discovery. They discovered this in 1967, and it wasn't until 2016 that they re-looked at it, and their mind was blown when they did some dating. There is literally one of the most prolific assemblages of lithics. And what I mean is knives and scrapers, hundreds of them precisely napped 500,000 years ago by what might be an unknown hominid. Some claim it could be Homo heidelbergensis, but this is right around the time of their demise when they go extinct. So I'm not so sure a culture that's this advanced, making all these tools, just dies off the map. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So really fascinating show. So today is unfortunately the historic 44th anniversary of the Mount St. Helens eruption. How old were you? 3, 4?
I was 3, so I don't remember this at all, which I find really unfortunate.
Yeah, and it was weird. TV kind of was still sucky. It was like the only thing you had was like a few channels, and everyone watched TV at night from like 6 to 9. There was all those stupid sitcoms. But I remember it blowing up, and the coverage was amazing. And the reason is because there was a lot of warning. So for months, weeks before, there was huge amounts of inflation. We're talking hundreds of feet of inflation on the side of the mountain. So that was very telling.
We're not talking about monetary inflation.
No, hundreds of feet. The mountain was swelling like a zit, and they knew it was going to blow. I mean, there was no other option but blow. And so what that allowed them to do over a period of weeks and months is get everyone away from that volcano.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they couldn't mandate that even though it was a mandatory evacuation, they didn't physically remove people that wanted to stay because we have this thing called the Constitution. Yeah. And back then they actually abided by it.
Right. Nor should they pull people away, right? If you want to die in a volcanic explosion, that's your business.
Right. The captain goes down with the ship, doesn't he?
Yeah. Aren't we all responsible for our own choices? I mean, the loss of stress on personal responsibility in this world is truly sad.
Yeah, so back in 1980, the technology was much more limited than till today. The photographic capability and filming capability was miserable with very low resolution. In the last 44 years, we have exponentially increased in technology, ways in which has never occurred in history. And so that could be very telling to what's happening in the near future as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're still in 1980, we're still in the phase of film, right? There's not really any digital photography. I mean, it's starting to come about, but that's part of the reason for not as good video evidence as we'd like.
But there were in place multiple photographers at a safe distance that captured some spectacular footage. From the top picture to the bottom picture was probably as fast as the frames could move, and you could see how fast the eruption was, or as fast as they could snap the picture.
Well, depending on the amount of light available too, that's going to change the how quickly the frames you can get.
Yeah, and what we saw was some of the most intense ash flows, lahars, and we all know about the famous picture of Spirit Lake with millions of logs in it, which are still sitting in the lake today.
Mm.
And a lot of people don't question how those logs could be still floating in the lake 44 years later, and they didn't rot.
Right.
Do you have an explanation?
I don't know the explanation, but I would assume there's some amount of petrification.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second. It's completely insane.
Yeah.
So Mount St. Helens, the access road has been closed now for 2 years, so no one can go up for the eruptiversary, they call it. Isn't that a nice word?
Eruptiversary.
Today is Mount St. Helens eruptiversary, but the visitor center roads are closed. If you want to get up there, you'd have to hike 5 miles, and the trail is open, so go ahead and do it.
We don't know why it's closed?
Yes, there was a major landslide 3 years ago that destroyed the road, so it's going to take a while to fix that.
Got it.
It's an unstable area, obviously, the largest, most destructive eruption in U.S. history. What's interesting is that photos are just being released from a pilot this year that has never shown the photos before in 44 years. So we'll have links to all that below where you can watch this little mini documentary and the photos he has. Again, they're nothing spectacular. There's the pilot up there. And
I wonder why he held on to those photos for so long.
Maybe there was enough photos out there. He didn't think his photos mattered.
Are you getting audio on your end of that from that news clip?
I turned it off so that we're not demonetized.
Yeah.
All right, so Mount St. Helens erupts today, 44 years ago. It caused enormous devastation in the localized area. Obviously, we showed you that picture of a car completely covered and submerged in ash. And it killed 57 people that day.
Yeah.
So the devastating natural disaster killed 57 people, was the most destructive volcanic eruption in U.S. history. It leveled trees, destroyed bridges, caused more than $1 billion worth of damage back in 1980. That is quite a significant amount of damage.
Yes.
And so you could see here, the entire center of the mountain is now missing after the eruption.
Amazing.
And this is early on. This photo, this dome continued to build for decades.
What's the diameter of the caldera? Do you know?
I would say several kilometers here.
Yeah.
Just by looking at it. Pick photo down bottom right is from a distance.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to get out of here. I don't know what happened.
Are you frozen?
No, I'm stuck in this. There we go. All right, so today, much of that hole has been filled in. Look at that. By a new dome.
Wow. Wow. So that's still pressure from underneath creating that dome.
Yeah, and it's this is the pic. This is just about 14 days ago, April 27th.
So, I mean, does that imply that there's a good chance of Mount St. Helens erupting again if that dome is building?
Excellent follow-up question. And
Mhm.
I led you right to the pudding. Yeah, the Cascade volcanoes, it's just not Mount St. Helens. We've got
Yeah.
Silverthorn Caldera, Franklin Glacier, Mount Meager, Mount Cayley, Mount Garibaldi. Those are just up in British Columbia. And then the U.S. volcanoes, Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, St. Helens, Mount Hood, Mount Jefferson, the Three Sisters, Newberry Volcano, Crater Lake. Don't forget Medicine Lake Volcano, Mount Shasta, and Lassen Peak, all in California. All of these volcanoes erupt all of the time.
Yeah.
And I'm talking every 100 or 200 years, there's an eruption at each and every one of these volcanoes. So here is the Cascades erupting in the past 4,000 years. If you're in the radio land now, you can't see this, but I'll walk you through it. And you could always rewatch the show tonight. Isn't that right?
Yes, tonight on Magnetic Reversal News at 8 p.m. Mountain Time.
So as far as the Cascades are concerned, the reason there are active volcanoes here, which are violently erupting, siliceous-rich volcanoes, all the same type. They do vary in magma depending on the bedrock associated with them. That makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you've got all sandstone, you're going to get a very violent erupting volcano.
Yeah.
More silica, more boom. So if you're in limestone or you're in granites or something else, you might get less siliceous and andesitic, and there's all different types of siliceous magmas. Like rhyolite, you've heard of that, right?
Yeah.
So if you can see this chart tonight, I'm going to explain it to you in Radioland. Some volcanoes erupt much more often than others. Take a look at Mount St. Helens.
I know.
In the
Like
last
clearly very
4,000
active.
years. Go ahead.
It's just clearly very active, like you're about to say. In the last 4,000 years, that's what, like 12 eruptions or something? 15 maybe?
13 eruptions in the
13.
last 4,000 years, and they come in clusters.
Yeah.
So like 2,000 years ago, there was 4 in a short period of time. And recently, including 1980, we've had 3 eruptions in the last 300 years from St. Helens.
And that's in a cluster, which means that cluster might not be done yet.
Yeah, we could get another one, especially
Yeah.
with that building dome.
Right. And it's been almost 50 years. So,
But there are other volcanoes that erupt often, like Shasta, Medicine Lake, Glacier Peak. So any of these, even Lassen erupted. So back in the Dalton minimum, and it's our supposition that based on all recent scientific data, and we take this from a multidisciplinary approach, that these volcanoes, siliceous-rich volcanoes, are activated by the sun. What we mean by that is that when we have weak solar activity, we have increased cosmic rays, and that heats these volcanoes. It heats the muons in the subsurface, and it causes them to erupt. And the black line on this chart is the Dalton minimum. And this is a high cosmic ray period where we can see Lassen Peak, Shasta, Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, Glacier Peak, and Baker all erupted during the Dalton minimum.
yeah.
And we've never seen that in modern times. So that's 6 volcanoes active in the Cascades in a period of a few decades.
Yeah. And it's
That would
certainly
be scary.
Yeah. And it's certainly worth thinking about, considering that we are entering a period of high cosmic rays right now.
Yeah, the last solar cycle, cycle 24, and the solar minimum between 23 and 24 was the cosmic ray maximum, the highest cosmic rays ever recorded in modern times. And then the solar minimum between 24 and 25 almost got as high as the other minimum. So we're living in the cosmic ray maximum. What will happen in 5 years during this solar minimum?
Right. And it's kind of a question of, what's the peak of the maximum as far as cosmic rays go. We suspect that we have a ways to go before we reach that peak. So there's a good probability of additional volcanic activity.
You couple that with our weakening magnetosphere, and it's going to allow even more cosmic rays in.
Right.
So let's talk about the good news. All of those eruptions back in the Dalton, None of them were as big as the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. So that's good news, right?
Yeah.
In the last 4,000 years, all of those Cascade eruptions, it's probably like there were probably like 200 eruptions in the last 4,000 years. They were all less than the Mount St. Helens eruption.
Right.
So they're all around between VEI 2 to VEI 4.
Right.
Which is
And
still
so,
nothing to sneeze at.
No, it's not. But it does, VEI up to VEI 4 were really much less worried about stratospheric effects and effects on climate because the material isn't going to get that far into the atmosphere.
Right. But what we have to worry about in modern times is all these volcanoes, there are millions of people that live nearby.
Right.
They're going to be screwed.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the serious eruptions in the Cascades and bring you up to speed to maybe give you some peace of mind. There are major eruptions. They could be climate changing eruptions in the Cascades, but the majority of them, we're looking at the biggest 4 or 5, the top 8 eruptions in the Cascades that we know of geologically.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are only 4 VEI 7s. And they're all pretty old except for the Mazama ash. Now, some people know what that is. Mount Mazama is now called Crater Lake.
Mm.
And it used to be the largest mountain in the West Coast until it exploded 7,783 years ago, creating Crater Lake and cooling the planet at VEI 7.
Mm-hmm.
The natives survived. This is in the legends of almost all of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest, as well as California. So that's
I wonder if they had advanced warning, like, in the form of earthquakes or something.
Well, and because they survived, probably they moved further
Yeah.
away. It was probably booming and earthquakes and small eruptions.
Well, and you could probably argue too that if those tribes had been living in that area for some period of time, they probably were well aware of the warning signals of a volcano potentially going off.
Yeah, the Crater Lake explosion is the 3rd largest eruption ever in the history of Earth in the Cascades. That's pretty significant, and it only happened 7,000 years ago. So one of the biggest eruptions in the Cascades was recent, unfortunately.
Yeah.
To get to the next eruption, the most recent large eruption, you have to go back 80,000 years to the Newberry volcano and the Olema ash and the TP Draw Tuff. And that's 80,000 and 230,000 years ago, respectively, both VEI 6.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there was a more violent eruption from Mount St. Helens in recent history. And so I kind of lied when I said they are all those are weaker. They all are weaker than the Mount St. Helens eruption, but there was a bigger St. Helens eruption recently in 1860 BC, which is just about 4,000 years ago. And this was, I believe they explain it, 5 times more powerful than the 1980 eruption.
Sure.
So that would be a game changer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what we can see here is we have VEI 6 and VEI 7s in the last 7,000 years. And that VEI 6 and 7s, based on this little data set, and we may be missing lots of the older eruptions because we just don't have enough geologists, it might be erupting at a catastrophic scale at a periodicity of every 4,000 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true, the last catastrophic eruption in the Cascades was 4,000 years ago. So we're due.
We're due, right.
We're due for VEI 6 or greater in the Cascades.
And then there's the relationship too with the moving plates, the Cascadian moving plates and these volcanoes as well, right? And we know that those plates are kind of always moving.
There's a great picture here. Yeah. So this is the reason all these volcanoes are here is because of this fault complex offshore, which we know as the Cascadia subduction zone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's driving this plate underneath of the North American plate and literally melting the plate and creating this lava.
Right. So, I mean, just
magma.
subduction alone, I mean, you can imagine literally you're pushing material under the other plate. So the pressure has to be released somewhere.
Eventually, somewhere and sometime. And if our supposition on expanding Earth, if it's the cosmic ray influxes or the magnetic excursions that accelerate the plates, that could also help explain why these eruptions occur at grand minima or at solar minima, because there is an acceleration of the plate movement.
Yeah. Well,
Or
and I
melting.
think that this also helps make a little bit of sense too of, and you may have to go back and watch some of our previous episodes where we talk about expanding Earth theory, but we talked a lot about this orange peel effect, where if the expansion is happening, it appears to be happening, expanding most in the southern hemisphere. So it's like it's opening up this way. So up in the north, like in this region, you would have to have material being pushed together.
Yeah, there's
like
compression.
such as what you see in this subduction zone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. All right, so I think and so we can look at a cross section to actually see what's going on there.
Yeah.
And so there's two things happening, and a lot of people seem to misunderstand that. So let me blow this up here. At the Cascadia thrust is not out here in the ocean. So what we have is a mid-ocean ridge offshore where the Pacific and the Juan de Fuca plate are a divergent plate boundary. One is moving to the west, the other is moving to the east, and it's the Juan de Fuca plate that is pushing underneath the North American plate, which causes the Cascadia subduction zone, which is the red line. So the mega thrust fault, the 9 magnitude Cascadia fault, is going to happen on this line, not out here.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when 5 magnitudes happen out here, people think that that's the Cascadia megathrust. No.
Right.
Or it's related to it. So there's two different faults. Does that make sense? One divergent, one convergent. And it is the Juan de Fuca plate subducting underneath the North American plate that's creating all these volcanoes.
Yeah.
All right, that was your geology lesson for the day.
Well, I have a question though. But so couldn't these faults, couldn't they actually be related though? Right? Just because you've got the expansion between the Pacific plate and the Juan de Fuca plate, which is pushing
so if
the Juan de Fuca.
expansion happens faster in the mid-ocean ridge, you get more subduction.
Right. Yeah.
There would be no subduction if there were no mid-ocean ridge.
Right.
To be quite honest. And that's what happened on the Atlantic coast. At some point, there was no more movement and it became a passive margin.
What did the Mid-Atlantic Ridge?
No, the East Coast is not active.
Yeah.
But 220 million years ago, when Africa was touching and we ripped apart, it was a mid-ocean ridge.
Yeah.
But because it pulled apart 1,000 miles, now it's a passive margin.
Right.
It could reactivate. All of these margins can reactivate. There's very little known about plates except pressure begins to push an ocean plate underneath the continental plate. And I think it has to do with expansion.
Right.
All right. We beat that with a dead horse. And there we can see the entire Cascadia fault zone right here in this graphic. And what it says here is the December 26, 2004 magnitude 9 Sumatra earthquake is comparable to the size of the Cascadia subduction zone. Also, I could have pulled up the chart on the periodicity of eruptions in Cascadia. We are overdue for an 8 magnitude and overdue for a 9 magnitude. So we're overdue for both types of earthquakes here.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. All right. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Yes.
All right. We're a little early here. In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about new evidence that complicates the story of the peopling of Americas and out of Africa. So the first story we're going to talk about complicates the story of the peopling of America for a number of reasons. Until recently, the Clovis first hypothesis is what everyone was taught at university level. In the last decade or so, so many studies have come out that literally throw this out the window.
Yeah.
What's interesting is for decades prior to Clovis first, the Smithsonian and other anthropologists, including Dennis Stanford, were well aware of dozens of sites that dated back to 16,000 years in North America that had Solutrean assemblages.
Mm-hmm.
But no one talked about them
Mm-hmm.
because it's the way science works. If you have a paradigm and you're doing work out in the field and you find something that doesn't fit the narrative, you hide it.
Yep.
And which is so sad.
Yeah, no, it's pathetic, and it's something that I complain about all the time. You and I were talking about this last night. Personally, I find it hard to understand why you would ignore evidence that counters your theory, except that I do understand from the perspective of people who are trying to preserve their careers, right? If you've built an entire career on a thesis and you've written books about it and you've taught classes about it and you've become known for it, and then a piece of evidence comes along that throws your thesis out the window, you have a career problem. However, I think that your career is a lot less valuable than the truth. The truth is far more important. And so I would so much rather see people honestly take into account the evidence that's available and have some intellectual integrity.
Yes, I agree. And so what's happened in recent years that complicates the story of the peopling of Americas is threefold. Number one, we've got genetics superseding all of anthropology. What once was speculation and people saying, oh, no one was here before 13,000 years ago. We have advanced technology that's advancing every year. And there is genetic sequencing that's been done that shows that the genetics in North and South America were here up to 50,000 years ago. That's the first thing, based on the genes.
Well, the genetics particularly point to South America.
Yeah, exactly.
But maybe we should back up here for 1 second and just explain the Clovis first theory for people who may not be familiar with it for comparison, right? So this idea is that the Clovis arrived here in North America as the first peoples over the Beringia land bridge when sea level was down, and that those were the first people ever that were here. But as we've just...
The problem with that, and when we're going to get to all of this in this by the end of the second half, and it has everything to do with why they haven't found lithics at these sites. Mm-hmm. Because, and here's the problem with archaeology and anthropology. They were basing everything, all the cultures, on the type of artifacts they found, which is why we make fun of the fact that they think Clovis people are different than Folsom people, right, when they're the exact same people that were in the exact same place. But after a mass extinction, they had to change the technology because they were now hunting bison instead of mammoth.
Right. The difference in artifacts is not a function of the people themselves. It is a function of the people adapting to the conditions in which they're in.
And here is the problem, which is now being revealed with these older dated sites, including in Europe. And they're now coming to with this understanding. Some of the early hominids, like Heidelbergensis, didn't use lithics. They used wood. And some of the oldest wood spears are from Germany that show that certain groups of people had no lithic technology, but they used spears. Mm-hmm. And so all you would need is spears and cobbles to get marrow, kill, and do whatever you need to do.
Right. It's like
go ahead.
It's basing a theory on a false assumption, right? The assumption is that all humans used lithics in a similar way at all times.
Yeah,
right?
These ancient hominids, 500,000 or 1 million years ago, that were bashing bones open, started to shard the bones, and one guy picked it up and realized it could be used as a knife. And so they started skinning with this piece, and then they started making tools out of bone.
Yeah.
because the first thing they were doing was eating the marrow and the bones. And then some guy realized these shards are sharp, or he got cut.
Mhm.
And then he started butchering the animals with the shards.
Right.
And so these cultures are millions of years old. So if there's anyone that's living in the Americas 50, 100,000 years ago, they may not have had lithic technology. They may not have needed it.
Mhm.
And this site in North America shows that there was a group of people living on a mesa that were hunting mammoth. They scared it over a ledge where it was injured, and then they probably stabbed it with wooden spears and butchered it in sight.
Mhm.
Or in the place, or they found a mammoth that had fallen off the cliff, injured, and that's how they might have been scavengers. These particular type of hominids.
Yeah, and another thing that's interesting about that, and it's touched on in this paper, and we'll get there, but the analysis of some of the bone fracturing basically shows that these would not have been scavenged sites. So for example, if you get spiral fractures in bone, it means that the bone is fresh. My question is I don't know exactly what fresh means. Like, can you still call something fresh? If there's a mammoth carcass that's 3 weeks old, is that still fresh? I don't know the answer to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fresh means that it within a year, so it's hasn't dried out to the point of where it's indecipherable.
Right.
So at some point you'll desiccate the bone. It's not fresh, and then if you break it in that state, it forms a
You're not going to
different
get
break.
those spiral fractures.
Right, exactly. So it's still got to be that juicy. That's probably up to a weeks or months from a kill, depending on how hot it is.
Yeah.
If it's
and
cold,
the other conditions,
it could be
Yeah.
months.
Yeah.
It stay fresh. All right, so Timothy B. Rowe, who now lives 400 feet from the site, which is kind of funny, is the one of the team that discovered this, and independently they got tons of grant money, which is kind of cool, to go check out and do really good science at the site. This is some of the most thorough work I have ever seen done anywhere.
This paper really, really impressed me. I mean, they really went above and beyond to cover all of the bases and cover, any holes in terms of what other theory you might consider or whatever. Just as an example, one of the bone samples that they analyzed from this mammoth, it's one bone sample. They broke it up into different pieces. They used 6 different types of chemistry to isolate the carbon from this one sample in order to date it. So they were like, let's be as thorough as we possibly can be so that we can get to the right answer without question. And I find it extraordinary.
Indeed. Now, the unfortunate thing is a lot of these scientists still believe in Clovis theory.
Yeah.
They even believe that hominids caused the Younger Dryas mass extinction. I mean, Timothy Rowe specifically.
That's amazing too, because in the discussion,
and he thinks this site is evidence of humans causing the mass extinction.
Timothy Rowe does?
Yes.
That's fascinating. I mean, especially if he still believes Clovis first, I'm confused, because the discussion in his paper very clearly argues against Clovis first. It's like, here's the evidence that cannot support Clovis first. It can only support that this happened.
He's playing
another group of people was here long before Clovis.
He's playing both sides of the fence, but he's what he reveals is the obvious, and it's what I was alluding to earlier. There were hominids in North and South America, and we covered this last week. The Paracas people clearly, and we'll get to that by the end of the show, came across the Pacific, jumping from Australia through Micronesia, Easter Island to South America. And the reason we know that is because of the haplogroup and the genetics.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what we have, and there could have already been hominids here that didn't have lithic technology for 150,000 years, because we've got the Cerruti site clearly there's a hominid that moved and stuck a mammoth tusks in the ground 130,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So we have evidence for 100,000 years. There are humans in North America that know how to hunt megafauna. They don't need lithics, and they're doing just fine. And sometime, I would say 15, 16,000 years is when we start to get lithics in the Americas, is when that land bridge opened up and we get the Solutrean technology that comes over, which then becomes Clovis technology, which then becomes Folsom, and then all of the North American tribal lithics.
Yeah.
So the Native Americans, I don't think, are genetically related at all to the people we're talking about.
Well, then that's exactly what they talk about in the discussion of this paper, and this is the part that's partially really compelling. There's a genetic signal that starts with people in Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. It's like a kind of like a ghost signal. They call it here population Y. That genetic signal is not in North American natives, but it is in South American natives. Additionally, there's a linguistic signal that shows up in all of the dialects in South America, but it is not in North America. So one of the things that they propose here is that prior to Solutrean, well, they're just talking about Clovis here. So prior to anybody coming over the Beringia land bridge, that there's another group of people thousands of years earlier that maybe come, they propose the idea that maybe they also come through the land bridge, eventually are displaced in North America by the Clovis, but are not displaced in South America. I think probably the better explanation is what we were just talking about, that you've got people from Asia, probably coming over the ocean to South America.
Yeah, and here's the problem is this is the map they use at university. It's only 5 years old, and it's a Clovis first map using genetics, where they show that the genes up here show that these people up in Siberia 25,000 years ago crossed the bridge, and they got here 16,000 years ago, and they got down into South America 14,000 years ago. So this would explain Solutrean, lithics, and then Clovis down in South America. It took them 2,000 years. It took them 2,000 years to walk to South America. That I find ridiculous. But here, look at the map. Here they have out of Africa 200,000 years ago. We're about to talk about hominids 500,000 years ago in Poland.
Right.
This whole map is completely false.
Right. Like, why are we still working with this thing?
And you can clearly see here some of the oldest dates move the out of Africa to Australia 65,000 years ago, which is when they came across into the Americas.
Yeah. Well, I want to throw out there too that genetic signal population Y, it is found in northern China. There's a 40,000-year-old human in northern China that has that signal as well. So I'm wondering if maybe some of these people did come over the Beringia land bridge, but other people came across the ocean.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. Let me bring this up. Where is it? Here. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Polish cave. That time period is back here during the Ice Age. The time we're talking about is at the coldest point on Earth with the lowest CO2 ever in geologic history. That there are people in North America that are scavengers. Now, that would make 100% sense because there's nothing growing on Earth. It's completely devoid of rain. The dust here is the highest dust concentration ever on Earth. It's at glacial maximum. There's almost no plant life. Humanity is barely hanging on. CO2 drops down to about below 200 parts per million.
Yeah.
And so it's probably easy to scavenge or to like scare megafauna off of cliffs at this point because they might be starving to begin with. That's just a fascinating side.
Well, it's also worth noting that sea level is going to be a lot lower at this time. So that's
the lowest ever in history. So we're down here at the glacial maximum, lowest CO2 and lowest sea level.
Yeah. So that's just
lowest rainfall. All of the moisture on Earth is locked up in ice.
Right. Right. So I mean, yeah, it's a good trigger for migration as well.
Yeah. And for survival.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
All right. So what is the evidence at the site? Well, it's clear. Here we see a clear smash mark that is proven to be impossible to happen by nature.
Mhm.
So there's the first line of evidence. Second is there are multiple bones with holes drilled into them.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, and I found this completely fascinating, right? So there's a whole discussion in here about how, okay, so if you have a canine, an animal, a carnivorous animal with canine teeth is biting into a bone, what you're going to get is a hole that is narrower on the inside and wider on the outside. These holes are not like that. They are the opposite. They are wider inside and narrower outside, suggesting a tool that's kind of being pivoted in there. But also you have whole sets of ribs that are all punctured in the same way. There's a process and a technique with all of this that is repeated again and again. And it is also found at other butchering sites, archaeological butchering sites. You know, so it's like there's a whole technique that has been established here based on experience that's being repeated. These people know what they're doing.
Yeah, and it's all sorted into piles as if there's different people working on different piles.
Right. So you're going to put the bones that you need this tool to work on. You're going to put them over here in this pile, and you know this type of bone over here where you need this tool. You're going to put it over on this pile. It's assembly line style. It's like, you know, Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. Ancient humans did.
More interesting, this archaeological site, unlike others, they saved every single grain of sediment. It's completely insane, and they looked at every single grain of everything.
Yeah.
And what they found is that these people, not only that they were so self-sufficient that they had multiple layers of processing at this site. So first you get the bone, then you sort them. Then some of these have good marrow, so I drill holes in them and I can get the marrow out this way. And then this other guy is just smashing the tiny rib bones to smithereens to get each piece open and then boiling that in water to get the marrow to boil out.
Right.
And then they're reprocessing them again by throwing them in the fire to get a hotter fire.
Yeah.
It's literally because why am I going to go get wood? I'm just going to use what I have. I'm using everything on this animal, everything.
I didn't realize until reading this paper that bone was often used as fuel for fires, which is interesting because, you know, you get a much hotter fire that way, and that maybe helps you with some parts of the processing.
Yeah, because you can't get 100% of the marrow out, so you're going to have a nice hot oil fire.
Yeah.
Like a paraffin wax.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we also have chop marks, which are like evenly spaced, same kind of chop. It's like no natural force can make these chop marks.
And there's also something like, you know, 85% of all of the flakes, et cetera, that they found are they're flaked in a particular way. They're either flaked parallel to the grain of the bone or perpendicular, which is very purposeful, right? It goes to show that, again, I mean, none of this could have happened without humans. So humans had to have done this because, again, you've got this repeated technique that keeps showing up again and again.
That's the key. They're doing it in a specific way to get those two different things. So one guy's processing it one way for one thing, the other guy's doing it the other way. Yeah. And they're all like that. So it's not like they're guessing what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing.
Right, because they've done this before many times, right? So if you find another site like this, you're going to find in the same time period, you're going to find the same techniques.
And so we have the same, everything is the same at the Cerruti site 130,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
All of the same evidence.
This is like 37,000 years old. Like the oldest it would be about 39,000 years ago is really the oldest possible date. So that's interesting too, because you have a technique that is very similar, you know, 100,000 years later.
The same people at the Cerruti site 130,000 years ago are the same people here in New Mexico, which probably are the same people in White Sands 22,000 years ago walking along that lake.
Yeah.
Because the technology, the salutary and the lithic technology did not get into North America that we know of until about 16,500 years ago.
Right.
And I'm sure that as those cultures passed each other, they all learned about the lithic technology.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I think you could easily make that argument. Sure.
So now we've got to change archaeology to understand that for maybe 150,000 years, people living all over the world were not using lithics, which is why we don't think there were any people there.
Yes. Right. Yeah, and I think that there's even part of the discussion sort of touches on that issue. It's like, well, part of the problem here is that we don't have, well, not only do we not have the lithics, but we don't have the human remains in North America prior to 16,000 years ago.
Yep.
So that's another problem. It doesn't mean it's not there. We just haven't found it.
Yeah, we will.
Yeah.
And Timothy Rowe also stresses, because a lot of people are like, this is not a butchering site. And he says, no, this is not a butchering site. This is a bone processing site.
Yes.
The butchering was somewhere else. There's no evidence of butchering here. There's evidence that they brought bones here to process.
Yeah.
Whatever
Or
that
the
means.
bones were there and they took the meat somewhere else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So fascinating site. I would give this almost a 90% more that this is actual humans.
Oh, easily. I mean, I would put it at like 99%. I just don't see how you could, there's no way that you could create the repeated patterning of bone flakes and fractures and all of that without human intervention. It just is not possible. Even just those puncture marks alone.
And so
that's not going to happen naturally. It's just not.
Yeah, we'll leave you links to the paper. There's great pictures where you can see where these bones clearly are placed in a big pile here. There's no bones anywhere else next to rocks and cobbles, where this is the anvil. These are the bashers. They would put the bones up here, take these cobbles and smash them. It's that simple.
Yeah. One other thing I just want to point out, just a kind of a little bit of a caveat. I mean, we talked about that we have a technique of bone processing here that's apparently been repeated over many thousands of years. And I don't think that we can conclude necessarily from that these are inherently the same people, because it could very well be
same techniques.
Right. But I think that you could argue that the same techniques exist because that is the most efficient way to process bone, period. Right. It could very well be that you have different groups of people that arrive at the same conclusion because it's really just the best way to do it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So 99.9% people. Now, if you want to watch the main author talk for an hour and a half about the paper and the discovery, and you will learn everything. It is on the internet, on YouTube, a surprise encounter with a 37,000-year-old mammoth in my backyard. It's an amazing hour and a half. You don't have to read the paper because he goes over everything plus more, including the fact that he still believes in Clovis first.
That's
but
so
he
weird.
explains,
I don't understand. How did he get there?
explains if this is a human occupation, Clovis first is correct, but it means that lithic technology came at that time. There were already people here. You get it?
No, I don't. How can Clovis first exist within that? I mean, this is a 37,000-year-old site.
Technology arrived, not the people.
Oh. Okay.
They just got it wrong. They thought it was people that showed up. There were already people here. There was some dude that came with the technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fair. That's totally fair.
Yes. Got him.
Yeah.
All right. So now the new genetics we're looking at here is we've got two groups of people. We have a group of people that can move in 16,000 years ago. We've got a group of people that could come in 13,500. And much earlier, we've got a group of people that could have come in 150,000 years ago this way.
Yeah. Or it could have been 50,000 years ago. We don't really know. Yeah.
Well, the Cerruti site, they had to be here 130,000 years. The Cerruti site.
Right. Yeah.
We had to be here that long.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back even further and blow your mind. How do I get rid of this? Oh my God. 500,000-year-old signs of extinct human species found in a Poland cave. Prehistoric stone tools found in a cave in Poland 50 years ago were recently identified as some of the oldest ever discovered in the region. And it was simply using taphonomy or a taxonomic approach to archaeology. They didn't initially do that in the 60s. What they did is they went here and they located some early Holocene fossils in the upper layers. And they're like, oh, this is probably like 14,000 years old or 12,000 years old or something. Then they found some artifacts and then that was it.
Yeah.
And so decades later, they went and looked at this again. And they discovered that the lithic assemblage was associated with fossils that were extinct as old as 400,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And there are 8 species in total they found that were all extinct by 300,000 years ago. And that is 8 lines of evidence showing that these lithics are 300,000 years or older.
Yeah.
That's just the starting point.
Yeah. And they did a really good job too, it seems to me, to really reevaluate the sedimentary layers that were found. And, you know, whether any of that material could have just flowed into the cave, which the answer to that was basically no.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated the reanalysis that they did.
The stratigraphy is excellent and precise, and you can see it here. You can also see all the extinct animals that they found at each layer, which is proving that this stuff down here goes from about 300 to 500,000 years ago. And this is the layer where the lithics are from.
Yeah.
Now, what we do know about hominids at this time is that they were using wood, the Schonenberger spears or whatever they're called in Germany, 300, I think, or more thousand years old. And wood would be the easiest thing to kill things with and to figure out when you're figuring things out. You're not going to think of putting a spearhead on a spear. You're going to make the spear out of wood first. And there's evidence hundreds of thousands of years ago that not only were they using the wood, but they're using fires to harden the wood.
Right.
You burn it and you rubbing the tip.
Yeah.
And so that could be a huge reason why we don't find any evidence of people around the world, because wood just doesn't get preserved.
Right. And
they did find that log structure that's over 300,000 years old in Tanzania.
But that was, you got it right this time. But that was just by luck, right? I mean, that wood was petrified because it was underneath a riverbed, right?
No,
so
I don't think it was petrified. It was anoxic, so it was still wood.
Right. Yeah, right. Okay, so, I mean, you have to get lucky to find wood artifacts.
Well, and we're getting luckier and luckier.
Yeah.
So the lithic assemblages here are mind-boggling. There are so many different shapes and forms of devices. It's unimaginable that these are 500,000 years old. There's specific drills. Now, these don't come back into fashion until recent times in the last 4,000 or 5,000 years with Native Americans. There are drill assemblages that go back into the pre-pottery Neolithic, all the way back 14,000 years ago. But this is 500,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So what happened from Gobekli Tepe to these people?
Right.
Nothing? Nothing happened?
Right.
Man, are we missing some volumes of history?
Well, I mean, even just thinking about the issue of wood artifacts, you know, if you can use your imagination, know that any wood artifacts that we have found are just based on the pure luck of preservation. So imagine how many more of them there were that we will never find, you know, and that gives you a much bigger sense of what hominids were doing long, long ago.
Yeah, I mean, so if this technology 500,000 years ago shows drill bits and knife blades and spear tips and scrapers, it's all the same technology as 10,000 years ago. How far back does it really go?
Yeah. Right.
This is some very advanced flint knapping. I mean, all different. This is a refined edge. And what's interesting here is they did such good work here that they took the flint knaps and the tools and they reassembled them back to the cores, which they also found at the site. this is such advanced technology. It's similar to Clovis, where they get a core and they have, it's amazing. It's a half a million year old technology that should not exist.
Well, but it's also the same thing as the 37,000-year-old occupation, in the sense that there's a repeated technique that shows up here, right? And all of this, when you think about it, these tools are absolutely necessary. Like, I don't think that 500,000 years ago we have hominids walking around who are vegetarian, right? That's not happening. You need meat. You absolutely need meat.
No,
so it's not, in another way, it's not surprising to find these lithics. Wow. There it goes.
Yeah, we're going to link you to the paper and check it out. We'll replay this tonight on Magnetic Reversal News, 8 p.m. Mountain Time.
See you there.
On YouTube.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.